I fail to see the purpose of this, Kamakura-kun said, repeating his words from his birthday as he settled down on the couch with his back to her. Human beings change how they wear their hair according to environmental needs, such as being overheated or attempt to increase how others perceive them. I feel no discomfort at the moment, and you are not so shallow as to be swayed by a hairstyle. Ergo, there is no need to perform such an action. Chiaki hummed, experimentally taking a fistful of black hair and running a brush through in search of knots.
Well, why do you think I want to?
She hadn't succeeded in making him smile on his birthday, or the days and weeks after, but she hadn't given up. For the past few weeks, she'd tried different activities. Sometimes, instead of playing video games, she'd asked Kamakura-kun to spend the afternoon reading books with her, or watching movies, or folding paper cranes. Once, she asked him to plant flowers outside, under the pretense of wanting some color, and after spending a few days creating a formula that would help the seeds adapt to the pollution, he did just that. She was rather put out to learn the seeds wouldn't be sprouting for several weeks, unlike in Harvest Moon. None of it seemed to resonate with him, though. There wasn't any click, any moment where he looked like he'd found his passion. If anything, the video games, especially competitive ones, came closest, since that was what Chiaki was best at. And it did make Chiaki happy to know he, found them less boring than most activities, especially when she noticed she was actually doing slightly better against him. But she still looked for other activities or hobbies he might like. Today's attempt was hairstyling. He paused, tilting his head slightly as he pondered. The most logical conclusion is that you are attempting to increase your fingers' dexterity with exercises like hair plaiting. She shook her head firmly.
Nope. I want to do it because I want to. There's no deeper reason.
Other than wanting to make him smile, but she wasn't going to say that lest he feel obligated to.
Besides, who knows? Maybe you'll like whatever I do with your hair.
He didn't respond, and Chiaki took that as her cue to begin, filling the air with small talk to keep him from getting too bored.
I used to do this with some of the girls in my class, you know. When we were getting ready to go to a festival or something, we'd all help each other get dressed up. It was a lot of fun. You wouldn't know it from looking at her, but Owari-san was actually pretty good at it. She said she used to have to do her little sister's hair all the time. Didn't care much for styling her own, but she'd do everyone else's.
Nostalgia rose in her as she recalled getting ready for their first-class festival, Owari-san rolling her eyes at Sayonji-san and telling her to
Stop squirming. You're worse than my youngest sis.
You're yanking too hard, you stupid... Ow!
giggling with the other girls as Sayonji-san pouted, looking very much like a child. Swallowing the bout of wistfulness, Chiaki smiled, though he couldn't see it.
Oh, but don't worry. I think I gained enough EXP in that skill. You shouldn't look too bad.
She placed the brush aside and started weaving. There was something oddly soothing about this, the motions of looping and twisting his strands of hair together into a thick braid. They felt smooth, like silk, and Chiaki took a guilty moment to run her fingers through them in admiration. His hair was just so nice, and she spent a bit longer than she should stroking it. Her fingers stilled in their dance across his skull. There was a bit of raised skin beneath them, rough in texture, and she traced it, hypnotized. It snaked from the side of his head down to behind his ear and around to the other side. With his mass of hair, it would have been completely invisible to the eye.
This must be...
The scar from my various brain surgeries. He monotoned, guessing what she was thinking. Chiaki paused. The air suddenly felt heavier, as if she'd set foot onto sacred ground.
Does it hurt?
She asked quietly, so soft as to almost be inaudible. But she knew he'd hear. A noise that almost qualified as a scoff left him. Of course not. There is no reason it would. She didn't answer that. Her scars hurt sometimes. Phantom blades of pain slicing them in the waking hours of her nightmares. But then again, he cared about what had happened to him far less than she cared about what had happened to her. A somber mood settled as she wordlessly resumed her work.
All right, done,
she announced a short time later, wrapping the end off with a band. He rose. His hair was so long that even now it still fell to his waist. Chiaki handed him a small mirror and took a moment to admire her handiwork. The braid was rather messy and loose, slung over one shoulder, but with his bangs pulled back and tied into it, you could actually see most of his face now. Combined with the suit, the effect was striking. Her breath caught.
It looks good on you,
she told him as he dispassionately examined his reflection, and meant it. His eyes flicked towards her briefly, inscrutable, then away. Attractiveness is subjective. What you define as looking good is not the same as what someone else defines it as. Chiaki's smile faded a little.
You don't like it?
I hold no particular like or dislike for it, he said flatly. Her crestfallen look must have touched something in him, though, because after looking at her face, he continued, However, I appreciate the intent behind your gesture.
Well, maybe I can try a different one another day, if you don't mind.
Do as you please, was all he said, but the words lacked any real coldness. February came brisk and cold, but not as cold as the past few months had been, and so the snow outside was beginning to melt. Chiaki appreciated that. Her cane was prone to slipping on the wet clumps, and after the fourth time she'd fallen, she decided it was just better to stay indoors before she permanently hurt something. Start with your strong leg going up, start with your weak leg going down. The stairs were her current opponent. Kamakura-kun was a step below her, supporting her and ready to catch her if she fell. Chiaki really was trying to pay attention to what she was doing, but she was oddly distracted by his hand, large and warm, against her lower back. She let out a tiny yelp as she started to tilt backwards. A light but sure push righted her. Balance, was all the black-haired man repeated. The ultimate gamer exhaled, shakily lifting her right leg. She had to raise it higher than she did for regular walking, and tears stung the corner of her eyes as the underused muscles screamed. Even with the cane and Kamakura-kun helping, her left leg trembled, almost crumbling from the combination of keeping her balance and holding her up. Move the foot forward, set it down, take a moment to breathe, push up with the stronger leg, and use the momentum to lift the weaker one. Drag it up behind you, set it down, take a moment to breathe, repeat. Enough, Kamakura-kun proclaimed when he saw how much she was sweating. Relieved, Chiaki lowered her foot. The ultimate hope quickly scooped her up and carried her back down the steps, moving so swiftly he may as well have been not touching them at all.
5 steps isn't so bad,
she decided as he set her on the couch and moved to get her some water. That was a third of the way up. The key to grinding wasn't to think about how far you had to go, but how far you'd come. Even so, it was harder to keep a positive attitude about her physical therapy lately. It felt like her progress had hit a plateau. Chiaki could successfully look back over the past 9 months and point out the milestones, but now there were far less. There hadn't been any major changes. It was mostly just rebuilding her strength again and improving the skills she'd already regained. Not helping things was the fact that she still had to use the cane to walk more than a few steps. They'd been practicing walking without it, and Kamakura-kun estimated that she could be off it permanently in another month or two, but that seemed very far away. She sighed. "Nanami?" Kamakura-kun called, and though his voice hadn't raised in inflection, she could still hear the question in it. She hummed and glanced over. He'd walked out of the kitchen, and she could see he was holding...
Oh no. Could you maybe forget you saw those?
She asked with a wince.
They were supposed to be a surprise.
You did a poor job of hiding them in that case, he remarked.
Come on, they kind of had to stay in the fridge. And I was going to give them to you soon anyway. They're Tomo Choco,
she added, in case he mistook them for Giri Choco. Nervousness fizzled in Chiaki's stomach as he continued to stare at the handmade chocolates in his hands. It hadn't been easy to make them without him noticing. She hadn't even had a chance until he ran errands this morning, and her nerves had been on fire as she hurried them out. She'd gotten her male classmates Tomo Choco last year, of course, but those had been store-bought. Making them herself felt more personal. Then he said something that surprised her. "After lunch, eat them with me." She blinked.
Huh?
"I will not consume these all myself. High amounts of sucrose cause a variety of health problems," he said dryly, placing the chocolates down and handing his original goal, the cup of water, over. "And you are the one who insists things are more enjoyable with someone else." Chiaki smiled softly as she took the cup from him, their fingers barely brushing.
That's right. I am.
End of Chapter 11. Author's note. In Japan, there are several types of chocolate you give out on Valentine's Day. Giri Choco is obligation chocolate, which isn't as bad as it sounds, but is still kind of impersonal. Tomo Choco is friendship chocolate, and Honmei Choco is the romantic chocolate. Generally, Giri Choco is cheap and store-bought. Tomo Choco can be homemade or better quality store-bought, and Honmei Choco is almost always homemade. If you're disappointed she's giving him Tomo Choco instead of Honmei Choco is the equivalent of a confession. Chiaki's definitely not at that stage yet.